Good afternoon. I'm going to share a very personal family perspective. It has to do with love, courage, advocacy, and choice. And like a lot of people who have spoken prior to me, we know this story could be about you. Because illness and end-of-life issues and ultimately death will come to all of us. And it is my hope that by sharing this story, I answer some of your questions and concerns, and I bring you and your family and your friends greater peace of mind. I had a very loving marriage with my husband for 26 years. Alan was a very special man. I never met anyone who didn't like him. He was a Harvard graduate, a computer scientist, a practitioner of neurolinguistic programming, a jazz pianist, and most importantly, a very gentle man. In 2006, Alan developed an HPV viral wart on his right vocal cord. And we started going down to the Med Center in Seattle every 3 to 4 months so he could have this removed. And in between, he'd kind of lose his voice, and then we'd go down again and would get a little bit better. And we did this every 3 or 4 months. In 2007, we both began to notice cognitive changes in Alan. And he was examined by a neuropsychologist, and they could find nothing wrong with him. In 2009, he was getting worse. We noticed more cognitive changes. He went back to the same neuropsychologist. They gave him the same about 2.5-hour cognitive profile assessment. They couldn't find anything wrong with him. In 2011, toward the end of 2011, he was finally diagnosed with dementia of the Alzheimer's type, is what the doctor called it. Obviously, this disease, like many diseases, begins to occur long before it can become detected. Only 6 weeks after his Alzheimer's diagnosis, he was also diagnosed with laryngeal cancer in the area where they were removing the viral wart from every 3 to 4 months. The cancer needed immediate attention. The throat surgeon told him that he would die a painful death within 6 to 12 months if he did not have 3 invasive surgeries, and that there was at least a 30% chance that he would not be able to breathe or swallow or speak well following each surgery. And after very careful consideration between the two of us and him doing his own soul searching, he made a decision: there will be no surgery. Instead, as his advocate, keep in mind, he had Alzheimer's. I had to do everything for him. I contacted End of Life Washington, which was then Compassion & Choices, and he became a client. We did have 2 doctors in our county, 2 fine doctors in our county who met with us, and he qualified for the Death with Dignity law. And I received the prescription, and I put it in our file. I believe it had a 6-month expiration date on it. Since that was taken care of, which meant that we had an out, we then began a very intense program of my researching and then Alan doing alternative health modalities. By the way, I have a very detailed website at phyllisschacter.com with all this information, including the cancer situation. And I did put my cards in a basket in the classroom. And my TED Talk is on the face page of on the home page of my website. I became like a drill sergeant, literally following Alan around because he had Alzheimer's, from morning to night, to take care of whatever the naturopath or whoever was prescribing for him. We were both kind of in Alzheimer denial, even though for years now we were noticing cognitive changes, but the cancer was right in front of us. Alan healed from the cancer in 4 months, completely. The throat surgeon said the exact words that Alan visualized him saying. Within a relatively short period of time, that was in April, it was on my birthday, April 10th of 2012. He had a couple of decent months, and I thought, Alan's going to get a second lease on life for at least a few more years. But I remember the week when the Alzheimer's, it was just like, wham, I'm here, and I'm here to stay, and I'm going to get worse. And that week, all I remember from that week is that the two of us together cried and cried and cried. Ultimately, Alan decided to voluntarily stop eating and drinking rather than live into the late stages of Alzheimer's. It took him 9.5 days to die, and he died in April of 2013. He had witnessed his mother's severe decline with Alzheimer's for more than 10 years, and he was absolutely certain that he was not going to experience this. 6 months before he died, he said he wanted to be at his own funeral, his own celebration of life. He used to laugh and think it was funny that people had funerals after they died. He was very clear. He wanted to be privy to all that love and attention. And we had a beautiful celebration of life in this room. I was kind of sitting in about the same place as I am now. After the celebration, I contacted End of Life Washington. They referred me to one of their volunteer chaplains because I needed some personal support myself. She suggested that I learn about VSED, which I had never heard about as an end-of-life option. Soon I found a long white paper by Thaddeus Pope, who's a health law professor, and he described VSED as a legal option. I shared the information with Alan, and after he read the paper, he turned to me and said, I've read the paper and I've decided this is what I'm going to do. I then began to question him for months. Are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure? Are you sure? You know, I mean, this was like a really big decision. Finally, he turned to me one day and he said, I've made up my mind. This is what I'm going to do. Please don't ask me anymore. A few weeks before he actually stopped eating and drinking, he was sitting at our breakfast table and I was standing nearby. And I looked over and I noticed that he was crying. And I said, honey, why are you crying? What are you feeling? And he said, I'm not afraid of dying. I've lived a good life, but I want everyone to know about VSED. Literally, before I could think of the words coming out of my mouth, I spontaneously replied, you'll just have to trust that I'll be your vehicle. And I'm doing this work not because he asked me, but because I need to do this, because it's time to do this. And I do feel we got picked for the assignment. And I have become a spokesperson for VSED. I also was the catalyst for the first national conference on voluntary stopping eating and drinking that was held about 2 weeks ago at Seattle University. It was a multidisciplinary academic conference, and it was very, very informative. There were over 225 people there. Why is VSED so important as an end-of-life choice? Alzheimer's is the fastest growing disease today. And we know that anyone diagnosed with Alzheimer's and most other neurological diseases will not qualify for the Death with Dignity law because, as we've heard, that law says you have to be in the last 6 months of life and mentally competent and be able to self-administer the medication. We know that Alzheimer patients, for example, are not mentally competent when they're in the last 6 months of life. So VSED, as a legal option, needs to be widely known for people with many different kinds of debilitating diseases. My husband said that even if he had had the choice to use the Death with Dignity law, he said he still would have chosen not eating and drinking because he wanted to have a more organic, conscious death. Being my husband's advocate so that he could have a dignified and loving death was the most difficult thing I've ever had to do. I didn't know anyone who had done this before. I had no guide or book to read. I received some information from End of Life Washington. I had to investigate all the pieces myself. Who would support us? How could this be done with dignity? Who would help Alan throughout the process? Was this legal? Who would take care of me? All of these questions were overwhelming. My entire life was devoted to this. As the following months went by, Alan actually became more and more comfortable and at peace with his decision, and he said to a few friends, when I didn't know anything about this, as probably very few people do, it sounded horrible. Now that I've investigated it, it doesn't sound horrible, and I'm going to do it. VSED. I'm doing it because I have a disease that will rob me of the ability to make this choice. I have Alzheimer's, and Phyllis and I went to visit an Alzheimer's facility, and I couldn't imagine living there. This helped me make my decision to VSED. Once Alan made his decision, he lived in a state of deep, calm, accepting presence. And he said these words to me: I am comfortable and at ease with everything. I just feel great all the time, even when I'm tired. People notice how happy I look, and I think that's important because I'm really at the end of this life. Before, I was burdened by all the things I thought I should be doing, and I'm not anymore. I have no fear of dying. Determining a marker and setting a date to begin VSED can be a big challenge, but it is essential. Alan, of course, wanted to live as long as possible, and he didn't want to miss his mark when he would no longer be mentally competent. Alan's main marker had to do with his quality of life. He determined that his marker B, when he could no longer leave the house to go to our local Center for Spiritual Living, where we are, he was done. He played keyboards in the center here for 7 years, and this was the community that we loved and that loved us and supported us. It was obvious that it was getting to be too exhausting for him to engage much with people anymore. And he said to me one day, when he came home, after we were at the center, he came home and said, I can't go to the center anymore. I'm just too tired. He was sleeping at least 16 hours a day at that point. He was losing functions quickly. He had other neurological issues that our doctor thought were probably related to Parkinson's. He had little affect in his face. He was shuffling when he walked. He was beginning to lose his balance. He was having difficulty putting words into sentences. He had very little quality of life. He could no longer leave the house and enjoy himself. And he said to me, it's time to VSED. And in that conversation, I agreed with him. And I told him I thought he only had a couple of more months left before he would no longer be mentally competent. To hasten the VSED process, Alan ate no more than 500 calories a day for 5 days. When he awoke on the morning of April 10th, 2013, he no longer ate food or drank any liquid. He basically just went to bed and stopped eating and drinking. We had known our doctor for several years, and she was aware of his wishes. And all of Alan's needs were met by me, our 2 caregivers, who are both here today, and our doctor. We all placed great emphasis on keeping him comfortable. Alan knew that he had choice about medication so that he could be comfortable. Yet he told our doctor that he wanted to receive as little medication as possible because he wanted to be as conscious as possible throughout the process. Fortunately, our doctor stayed one step ahead of him and made sure he was comfortable. I didn't want him to suffer at all. The amount of medication a person receives in this type of situation will depend on the doctor-patient relationship and circumstances. Good medical support is absolutely essential in this type of situation. Our doctor made 3 home visits during the 9.5 days. Each time she examined Alan and adjusted medication, and she gave instructions for his continued care. She was on 24-hour call throughout the entire time, and there were times we called her in the middle of the night. Each day, Alan got visibly weaker and more wobbly. It didn't take long before he couldn't get out of bed himself without assistance. He went from being able to toilet himself to using the commode, to using a urinal, and then a diaper. He was frequently turned in bed when he couldn't do this himself. His urine went from normal yellow to dark orange, and then it became very dark and minimal. He received a laxative suppository so he wouldn't get uncomfortable and constipated. On the morning of the 3rd day, I was surprised with a phone call from a social worker from Adult Protective Services. She said somebody had called them and reported possible elder abuse, and that she would be at our house in 10 minutes to investigate. I'm glad I didn't have more notice, because honestly, this visit stunned me. I initially spoke with the social worker, and then I took her into Alan's room. We sat at the foot of the bed, and she asked him questions about his choice. And then I left them alone, and I went and I called our elder care attorney. You'll be hearing her speak in a few minutes. And I also gathered all of our legal documents together. And then I had the opportunity to educate the social worker about Alan's choice. I showed her his health directive. I showed her his Alzheimer's Advanced Mental Health Directive. I showed her the long white paper by Thaddeus Pope describing VSED as a legal option. And I showed her the witness and notarized release and assumption of risk statements signed by Alan and me, protecting the doctor, the caregivers, and myself, where Alan took all of the responsibility for his decision. The social worker took many notes, wrote a positive report. The case was closed and it cannot be reopened. Later, I received a letter from the social worker, and these were some of her exact words. I'm glad to have met you, and I truly appreciate all I learned from you. Your courage, strength, and love were and are unique to behold. During the first couple days of Alan's fast, he spent most of his time in the room alone. He had already said his goodbyes, and each night his daughter would call on the phone, and we would put the speaker phone to his ear, and he could hear her loving words. On days 3 and 4, he had some increased restlessness, and he showed some signs of discomfort due to dehydration, and he was treated with appropriate medication. He never complained about hunger. By the 4th day, he wanted people around him more, and he wanted to be touched gently. I gave explicit instructions that if he ever asked for food or water, that I be the only person who could communicate with him about that. And on the 4th and 5th days, he did ask me for water. And this is exactly what I said. You said you wanted to stop eating and drinking because you want to die so you don't have to live into the late stages of Alzheimer's. I'll give you water, but if I give it to you, it will take the process longer. So would you like a glass of water, or would you rather have me just spray mists of water into your mouth until you're satisfied? And both times he said the mist of spray would be enough. Of course, I was prepared to give him whatever he requested. On the 6th day, Alan could only talk metaphorically and in gibberish. And on this day, I began to spend a lot of my time now in his little hospital bed with him. And while I was in bed with him on this day, he looked at his wrist and his imaginary watch and said, "I've got to get the milk. What time is it? The people are at the party." On day 8, we could hear the rattling in his lungs. He could no longer communicate with his words, and his eyes were now permanently closed. And on this day, I got very close to him and I said, "Alan, I am here with you. If you are comfortable, blink your eyes." And with his eyelids closed, he could move them. And I knew he was all right. And on this day, he mouthed his last words to me, "I love you." The caregiver awakened me a little after midnight on the 9th day. Alan's breathing had shifted and was now loud and rapid. I crawled into bed with him. And later that morning, the doctor came and examined him and said that only his brainstem was alive, but that his heart was strong, and she predicted he would live another 1 to 3 days. He was in a coma. After the doctor left our house, I went into Alan's room and I stood by his side, just waiting. And then I spontaneously began to talk to him. And I told him how proud I was of him, how courageous he was, and that he was going to get his wish. He was not going to have to live into the late stages of Alzheimer's. I told him this was our last partnership, and that I assured him I was going to be all right, and that now I would help midwife him home. And instead of it taking another 1 to 3 more days, like the doctor had just said, my husband went from that loud, rapid breathing to just a few more long, actually, breaths in 15 minutes, and he left his body with me standing by his side, loving him and talking to him. And what was I experiencing through all this? I was vulnerable, grief-stricken, anxious, and fearful. I knew that the only way I would ever get out of my grief was to go all the way through it. And that's exactly what I've done. And it has taken me a long time. I had good professional help. I'm very grateful that there's joy again in my life today, and that I have the ability and desire to do this work for the benefit of others. I partnered with my husband every day of our marriage. We helped each other become the best human being we each could become. I went through the normal grieving process of losing my husband, but my grief was complicated by the fact that we had minimal guidance about how to go through the VSED process. I experienced a lot of judgment based on other people's beliefs, and this resulted in my feeling traumatized with acute stress. If VSED had been an accepted and known choice in our culture, I believe I would have experienced much less stress. The reason I'm doing this work, the reason I'm here today, is to help move this end-of-life choice forward so that it becomes an accepted and supported choice in our culture. Beliefs and opinions about death vary widely. As our friends and family and community became aware of Alan's choice, we encountered a variety of other people's beliefs. For example, when I was looking for support and called our local hospice, they said they would not help Alan until the end stage of coma. That was the day that he died. I believe our hospices, the religious institutions that own some of our hospices, and Medicare need to address and support VSED. By the way, in recent years, as people have contacted me and I've helped give some other people direction with this process. I have found some hospices in the Seattle area that people have gone to, and on the second day they have been accepted into hospice to go through the VSED process. Caregivers had their beliefs. I had a hard time finding the right caregivers because it's true, caregivers endeavor to help people extend their lives with a good quality of life, not shorten their lives with a good quality of death. Some people in our community asked, is Alan committing suicide? We were not concerned what anyone said. We didn't care how anyone labeled it. All we cared about was that he was going to have a good quality of death on his terms. My husband, by voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, was actually saying yes to his life up to his last breath. He made a conscious decision with the support of loved ones. It gave him the opportunity to plan his death, to take care of unfinished personal and emotional issues, and to be able to say goodbye to his family and friends. Other people in the community had their beliefs and said Alan was dying prematurely. Yes, it was true. Alan could have lived longer. We couldn't time this perfectly. He did give up some quality of life in order to have a good quality of death on his terms. In the end, most of what we say and live by are beliefs, not the absolute truth. Beliefs shift and change. What are your own limiting beliefs about death? How do those beliefs affect your relationship with those you help and those you love? What you personally think, feel, and do is your own domain. But by hearing our story, it is my hope that you will have new perspectives and open your mind and your hearts to this end-of-life choice. I'm glad my husband fulfilled his desire to not live into the late stages of Alzheimer's. He said he wanted everyone to know about VSED. I'm carrying out his request because I witnessed his peaceful death. I respect his courage, and his demonstration broadened my view of my own death. He had a good quality of death, and he did this by voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. We can support people and give families an alternative to the horrors of Alzheimer's and other debilitating diseases. I'm concluding with a request. Please be proactive with this information. Share it with your families and your friends, your patients, your clients. Then let each individual choose. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis.
You asked us to question our beliefs, that might limit us to looking at this. And I'm looking at heal without cure, and I'm realizing lately I've been questioning what is the meaning of healing. And I'm wondering from your own experience if the process of healing never stopped up until the time of death, or how you would look at healing.
So, are you talking about my husband's perspective?
Yours or your husband's?
Let me repeat the question first. So he asked a question about what does healing mean in the context of this kind of experience, the choice specifically addressed to Phyllis. What does healing mean?
Thank you. It's a good question. When Alan didn't have quality of life and had reached a marker, he was done. He was done. My husband enjoyed life more than almost anyone I've ever met. And he faced his death with the same joy, not joy, but way he met life, he met death. And in fact, I was just interviewed for a magazine that's going to be the first magazine it's called The Art of Dying. And the interview that we had, I mainly addressed all the things that Alan did for about 6 months prior to his death that prepared him to die. He actually prepared to die. He prepared himself. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, I hope I have the same courage.
Great. Another question for any one of the speakers? Yes, Hillary.
I was curious if what states V said is legal, and if there's only a few, or what.
So the question is, where is VSED legal? Is it just in Washington State, or is it?
So my understanding is, and if I'm wrong, then our elder care attorney Aaron will correct this, but my understanding, it's legal in the United States. It's not a law, because in order for it to become a law, this situation would have to be contested and then go up to the Supreme Court where it became a law. But it is a legal option in the United States. Is that correct, Aaron?
Yeah, and I'll talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, so Aaron will talk about the legalities of it in just a few minutes. A question back there, yes.
My question is for Grace. How do you prepare two young sons for Ethan's death?
Can you use the microphone? Yeah.
Do you want to talk about it? I would
Repeat the question, will you?
The question is, how did we prepare our two young sons for this? And that's a great question. So when Ethan got sick, his older son, Seth, was 8. And our son was 2. And what I found at the time was that there wasn't much literature on how to talk about death with kids or illnesses with kids, but what I did find was to use age-appropriate language and just kind of speak to their level, but don't get too overly medical or technical, and don't make it very scary. So in some ways, Miles, who was a toddler at the time, we put it in the context of, Daddy's sick, he might not get better. And it was a much more nuanced and harder conversation with Seth, who was 8 at the time. And what I have found after Ethan's death that has been really helpful for my son Miles, who's now 9, is that there's a great resource, Our Treehouse, here in Bellingham, and its entire mission is to help kids with grief. So I kind of found more resources post-death than I did pre-death, but one thing that we were very open about is when Hannah, our hospice nurse, would come over, the boys would be with us, like all of us would be in the room at the same time, and we never closed the doors. We never said, we're not going to talk about dying or being sick. It was a very kind of open conversation, as much as the boys were comfortable with. So, in retrospect, it's hard to know how that happened, what the outcome was. But, I've told the story to Marie before, but John F. Kennedy Jr. once said in an interview that he didn't really remember saluting his father's casket after JFK was assassinated, but he had seen the video footage so many times that he thought he was there. And Miles was 3 when Ethan died, and so I really feel that there's sort of a lapse in Miles's memory sometimes. And so I think about that just in terms of Miles's grieving process. So I didn't really answer your question, but we were just trying to be as open as possible.
So for those of you who are interested in children and how they experience loss, that this is another initiative the Palliative Care Institute has been doing. We've been putting on presentations in our community called Not If But When. 1 in 7 children will face a significant loss before they are 18. And we as a society tend to hide death from children, so Grace's choice to let her children be part of the experience of death is not necessarily a typical one. We are doing another presentation on Sunday afternoon at Village Books at 4 o'clock. That event is free. There are little flyers about it out by the palliative care display in the lobby. So if you want to come to that, you can pick up a little flyer, or if you know people who need that. Our Treehouse is a terrific source. There's also Camp Willie, which is a campfire girl camp that runs 1 week of the year. There's a Camp Erin, E-R-I-N. If you Google Camp Erin, you'll find other resources, and there's a terrific resource in Portland called the Doogie Center. So there are resources around for helping children manage these very challenging questions that we have difficulty managing as adults, but there are support out there. Time for one more question, if you have it, and then we're going to go on to the next speaker. Yes.
My question, and I hope I'm not intruding on you, Grace, but if you had been aware, you and your husband, of the voluntary stopping eating and drinking, would that have been an option for you rather than the death with dignity?
The question is if we had been aware of VSED, if Ethan may have exercised
chosen
that
that
option.
versus the...
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. Ethan and I both voted for death with dignity in 2008, and of course it's like an airbag. You hope you never have to use it, right? I honestly can't answer that because I don't know the answer. I think in our situation for Ethan, the right thing for him to do was to take the death with dignity drugs, because that hastening of his death was entirely under his control. Phyllis, you had mentioned how, I don't know if the word was criticism, but how there was some judgment that Ethan was committing suicide. And Ethan wrote about this pretty eloquently. He said, the cancer is killing me, so I'm not killing myself voluntarily, I'm hastening my death in a way in which I have control over it. So.
Were you aware of the... Okay.
No. The New York Times just had an article on it.
I was just in the New York Times.
She was. Phyllis is in the New York. She was. Phyllis is in the New York Times.